Hey everybody, how's it going? Thanks for coming by. I've got a great guest, actually a returning guest on the channel today. My guest today is American Ostrakon. Thanks for coming on, man.
Hey, Auron, it's I'm happy to be back on the show.
Absolutely. So, one of the things that I wanted to get to, and we'll get to the topic of our talk here in a second, but I know that obviously a lot of people who are probably watching this are familiar with kind of the events of last night over in Washington, D.C., and your travels have actually brought you into Washington, D.C. for a few days, and you happened to be there while this was going on. Can you tell people who weren't there kind of what that was like, what you saw?
Yeah, sure. So I arrived about 11 o'clock in the morning, and the pro-Trump rally started at Freedom Plaza, and then the goal was to, and this is what they did, is they moved down Pennsylvania Avenue over to the Supreme Court, where they had quite a few speakers, Alex Jones being the main one, and there was a few others as well. So yeah, basically I just kind of followed along. I didn't really want to get that close. But I just kind of shadowed the march, as it were, and walked from near Freedom Plaza all the way over to the steps of the Library of Congress, which is right next door to the Supreme Court, and just kind of watched the whole proceedings as they unfolded. It was a lot of people there. Definitely wasn't a million, but it was in the tens of thousands. And I think I left around, it was about 4 o'clock. And from what I saw, it was fairly peaceful demonstration. There was a few scuffles here and there with a couple left-wing protesters, but from what I read, and from what everyone else has read, most of the violence or the conflict happened after dark, where most everyone had already gone home, and then you've got the more, let's say, aggressive or more hardliners on both sides were still in the DC area, and that's when it appears most of the violence happened. I saw a few Biden supporters who were escorted out of the group or the crowd from the Supreme Court, but for the most part, it kind of had just kind of a festival atmosphere. People were dressed up. There's quite a few people like me who came out just to kind of watch the whole event unfold. Some of the people off the hill, some of the staffers and whatnot, came up and sat with me, and we watched the events unfold. So, I mean, obviously they were angry, I would say, frustrated by the election results, but for the most part, everyone seemed fairly happy to be there, and they're having a good time. With the exception of a couple scuffles, but yeah, that's what I saw.
Yeah, I think most people, early on, they were kind of discouraging any counter protests by kind of your average Biden voter. But then, like you said, as the sun went down, you started to see the groups of Antifa roll in, and
Mhm.
and you start seeing some of them start to harass different factions. You can see them, running down and yelling at families and kids and things. And then once it got later, you really started to see them going after more of the Trump supporters, and you ended up seeing what ended up being all over Twitter last night. Like I said, I knew you weren't in the middle of it, but I knew you did see part of it. So I just wanted to touch on it for people who might be curious, kind of as to what that looked like outside. Not the focus of the talk, but I think a lot of people last night saw yet another event where a large number of militant left-wing protesters were coming in and disrupting an event, and turned it into from a protest into basically a riot or a conflict, and many people are pretty frustrated that it seems yet again that we're not going to see a lot of action to protect people who are marching on behalf of Trump, or to prosecute people who are attacking those people.
Yeah, I saw that there was a few arrests made, and that's just what I'm reading off the news. But during the daytime and during the scheduled event time, there was very little conflict. and then most of it was after the sun went down.
Okay, well, since we went over that, I just want to touch on that real quick. But for the main point of the talk, for those who are not familiar, didn't see your first appearance on the channel, you're a guy who was in the military for a number of years, had a lot of experience at different levels in the military, and then kind of left the military but still worked inside the kind of the military sphere later on. So you've kind of seen it from the inside and the outside. Can you just give a quick summary for people who are kind of unfamiliar with your background, as we go forward?
Sure. I joined the Army in the late 2000s. I served in the Army for approximately 10 years. And then after I got out of the Army, came back home for a little while. That's actually be a bit of what I'm talking about today, and tried to reintegrate into society. And that didn't really work out for me. So I went into contracting, federal military contracting after that. And I've been doing that ever since.
Yeah, so one of the reasons I wanted to have you on for this talk is, we had our first talk about kind of the state of the U.S. military and what you think might be happening going forward, your experiences, and how things have shifted when it comes to, the involvement of kind of, social justice and left-wing politics in the military, and how that's shifted over the years. But one thing that, no matter how people feel about how the government has been using our military, I think one thing that everybody probably should be concerned about is, the people who are putting themselves out there and making that sacrifice and serving the country. What happens when they come home? And so that's something that I think a lot about. And so when you and I were talking a few weeks ago, you mentioned to me this instance that's coming up, this phenomenon that's happening, which is kind of counter to what you expect, that as combat is reduced, as fewer members of the military are actually directly in combat, we're actually seeing a rise in PTSD diagnosis. And that's obviously counter exactly to what you would expect. And you had some ideas on that. So I wanted to just ask you a little more about that. What do you think is contributing to this increase in PTSD as the amount of combat decreases? What's going on there? What do you think?
Yeah, so I really didn't have too many thoughts on the subject until I recently watched a TED Talk by this gentleman named Sebastian Junger, who's a war correspondent, a war reporter, and he spent a lot of time in Afghanistan. And he kind of, the way he described it, it kind of flipped the concept on its head for me, and it really got me thinking, and which is why I wanted to talk about this with you. It's the issue. It partially maybe misdiagnosis, but what we're finding is that I think it's the nature of the society that we return to rather than the experiences in combat that are causing a lot of these PTSD issues. So as you said, a very relatively small number of people actually engage in combat in the military. It's around 10% of people who join the military actually see direct combat where they're being shot at or artilleried or mortared, and then they're returning fire. So but what we're finding is that even though, so that should be the amount of people, like logically, that should be 10% approximately should be the rates of the people who have the biggest issues reintegrating into society, right? 10% see combat, and therefore 10% should have the most extreme examples of PTSD, because this you would assume that, the more violence you see, the likelier you are to experience post-traumatic stress disorder. But what we're actually finding is it's approximately 50% of soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, people in the military are actually claiming PTSD, even though it's only about 10% that see actually combat. So it could be partially, what it is partially misdiagnosis, but what you're finding is that these claims are starting to crop up after they return back from combat, and they are no longer part of the military, or they are reduced in their connection to the military. So it's an issue more, I think, of reintegration, and it's not necessarily the failure of reintegration on the side of those people returning home, but rather the society that we come back to.
Yeah, and I think that is very interesting because obviously we're all, I think everybody who's probably watching this, who's familiar with this channel, knows we talk a lot about what's happening to society, and what we're really seeing is the creation of a very low trust society, something that is much different than many people are familiar with. And one of the things that when you and I were talking about this, one of the things that you brought up that I found really fascinating was that because so few people in the United States actually are involved in military, are familiar with combat or violence, it's an incredibly isolating experience for the soldier. And also because increasingly the society that they return back to is so, I guess, fake is the way to put it. It's so artificial, that shock of going from a very real, very human, very tight knit situation of combat or being combat adjacent in the military to then being plunged into this low trust artificial society, really you felt like was a big part of that trigger that is causing these reintegration issues and these possible PTSD diagnosis.
These claims of PTSD, which is more an issue of not being able to reintegrate than it is necessarily due to what happened to them in combat. Obviously, those people exist and require treatment, but you have a significantly more people who aren't in that situation that still have these very serious issues. And I think what you find is, modern society, or the U.S. society, is a difficult one to be a member of, right? We find that the more wealth that we have and the better society is doing economically, we actually have higher levels of depression, and we have higher levels of suicide and loneliness and child abuse. And these things aren't just related to the military. This is our society in general. But what you've done is you've taken all these people who have basically joined a high trust society where you have to rely on each other. You eat together, you sleep together, you do tasks together, you perform missions together, and you trust each other. And it's not even that it's a friendship. They often talk about like a brotherhood, and it is a brotherhood, sisterhood, whatever you want to call it, a family. Right? And these are people that you may not necessarily even like very much, but you trust a heck of a lot more than you would a friend that you did not have these shared experiences with. So you've got a very high trust society that you are a part of for, let's say you deploy and you're a part of that society for a year, where you have to rely on the individuals around you. And then you get sent back home, and you're, after a brief period of transition, you're basically on your own again. And now you're in a society where you don't know who to trust. You don't know how far you can trust your friends or people that you work with. Everyone has their own separate agendas, and it's terrifying. This is much scarier than combat in many ways. And you talk to, like, this past year where we've been very isolated due to COVID. And there were multiple times I called guys I served with, are friends of mine, and just like, after a year of this shit, I would prefer to be back in Afghanistan. And I'm not the only one who had that opinion. I would prefer to be back in a combat situation than live isolated as we have for this past year. And it's been happening prior to COVID as well, but it's definitely exacerbated it to an extreme. And I think most people have gotten used to it, but these military members are not used to it, and these returning military members have such a hard time dealing with this concept that it leads to suicide, and it leads to depression, of course, and a bunch of other mental issues and physical issues as a result. and it's a mark of our society. And this is, nobody trusts each other, but we have experienced a situation where we have had a high level of trust and people around us, and so to go back to this is terrifying.
Yeah, and I think a really good point you had there was the different agendas, right? Like in the military, of course, every social situation you're going to have people who are working against you. But in the military, it's required to be incredibly ordered, incredibly structured. You require that unit cohesion, you require that focus. Everybody's there to do a task. Everybody is there to do a job. It is very much like a far more, some would call it primitive, but I would just say a lost civilization where you had everybody was working to the betterment of the society. It was a small, closed society where everybody was trying to make sure that the tribe could survive, it could eat, it could defend itself. It very much goes back to what is a kind of the core human existence for most of the span of humanity. And now, like you said, we're in this situation where you don't know who you can trust. Our society is fracturing. You have different political factions, you have different ideological factions, you have just all kinds of different agendas and demographic issues, and so many people don't have, of course, a close home life or a close community. You've seen the loss of church or other organizations that would normally have bound a community together and given it a specific purpose. And so when military members are going from kind of this far more normal existence, what would have been a far more normal existence for most of humankind, they come back and that existence is treated as alien. That's treated as the weird thing, the outlier, the thing that is not supposed to be normal. That high trust thing is not what's supposed to be normal. What's supposed to be normal is being able to function in kind of this low trust, not unified society. That's, I think, like you're saying, I think that's what we're seeing those issues really come in.
Yeah, and it's not human, right? And we know it's not human intrinsically. Like we aren't supposed to function this way, and people have expressed themselves. I mean, it's so not human that look what it does to our psyche, to where these people, would consider killing themselves rather than live in a society like ours. I mean, that kind of says it all right there. But I'd like to unpack what you said a little bit. You talk about a high trust versus low trust society, and that's something that Younger goes into. He did a thesis on the Navajo tribe, and he thought to himself, I wonder if the Navajo, the Apache, the Comanche, all these different tribes had issues with PTSD, or I bet you they really didn't have many issues with PTSD because they didn't separate the war. They would fight each other, or they'd fight the U.S. cavalry, and then they would go back home to their tribes. And there was no disassociation with the military from the society, right? They were one and the same. Everyone fought for the most part. And as a result, you have this shared experience where everyone has a similar trauma, let's say, the trauma of warfare. And so because everyone has a pretty good understanding of what everyone else is experienced or will experience, you're not going to have those same mental problems that you would in a modern society. Or as a modern example, you can use like the Israeli military, where all people have to serve. And their PTSD rates are right around 1% to 2% as far as what's reported, which is obviously significantly lower than the U.S. military. That's not really so much a focus on Israel, as just you take any society that does not differentiate the population from its warriors, and you're going to have a society that's not going to have all of these issues that we do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the great ways to reflect on that for an American example is, of course, the transition from something like World War II to something like Vietnam, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, so when when we went to war in World War II, everybody went to war. Every military aged man in town went to war, more or less. And so when you went to war, it wasn't just an elite class or a small, removed, isolated class of people who understood the conflict or were working together. Instead, it was the whole country went, and those who didn't go all knew people. They were all related to those people. They were bound closely to the conflict. They sacrificed. They changed what they consume and what they grew and how they lived their life towards the war effort. When someone was lost in the community, everyone understood the weight of that because they had also experienced loss. It was a shared experience for the entire country in a very real way that permeated their lives. But when you get to Vietnam, we start to see that now it's a particular class of society that's going, more importantly, probably a particular class that doesn't need to go, doesn't feel the obligation to go. A lot more people falling out of touch. Obviously, the troops come home and they are treated horrifically. And of course, this is where we see really those instances skyrocket, and it's only kind of increased from there.
So what you've seen in Vietnam and beyond, right, is the scale of the conflict and the overall amount of conflict. Let's say the amount of combat is reducing significantly. So starting from the Civil War up until today, every single conflict that we've had is a lower tempo conflict, right? There are fewer casualties in each one of these conflicts, with Afghanistan being one of the lowest, as far as deaths and injuries. But the disability and the PTSD rates are climbing much higher, and you would think that wouldn't make sense, right, on paper. The higher scale, the more conflict you have, the higher levels, the more difficulty you would have mentally. But it's the exact opposite of that. And so and there are some other factors that you listed, like from Vietnam and beyond, right? If you have certain issues, if you have other mental issues prior to going into the military, or low education, or you don't have that family structure, you're more likely to suffer from long-term PTSD, which is a maladaptation to our society, versus like short-term PTSD, which is more what I suffer from, where I can still function in society, but there are times where it definitely comes out of nowhere, and it's been a few years now, and I'll still get, you still get bad dreams, or you'll still end up you'll have like a panic attack, or everything will fade out, and you tune out, and everything kind of goes black, and you're back on patrol. But yeah, it's again, it doesn't make sense unless you consider the society of which we come from. And then it actually makes a lot of sense, and it makes a lot more sense to me, how, because we come from this low trust society, it's only becoming more low trust. You have higher rates of people who have finally tasted or experienced a organization where they can trust the individuals around them. And of course, there are examples of not being able to trust the people around you, but they get weeded out pretty quickly. It's a very much you fit in or you go away kind of situation, because you don't tolerate people who are only have their self-interests, that they're only focused on their self-interest. Those type of people do tend to get weeded away, if not out of the military, then at the very least placed in positions where they aren't in life or death situations, or they don't have the potential to be in a life or death situation. It's not tolerated, or if it is, it's very, very often not tolerated very much. And so, you come back from that, and it's, I know I'm talking a little bit of circle here, but it's just getting worse. And that's, that for the nation itself really worries me.
Yeah, and I definitely want to expand more into that, because that was definitely the thing that lit up my, my mind when we were talking about this before, was definitely when you were talking about, what this means for society at large, what it means that our society has become a place where someone who has kind of tasted that brotherhood, that camaraderie, that community, uh, when they come back, and this is the not real part. This is the weird part. This is the fake part. And so I want to get into that, and we will in just a second, because I definitely want to explore that more. But one thing I do want to touch on before we go to that is specifically the isolation part, because as I said, as we see, especially the rise in Vietnam. Now, don't get me wrong, the rulers have never put themselves in direct danger. That's nothing new that you would see some rulers trying to avoid putting themselves in direct danger. But a healthy society has at least some portion of its elite class that is participating in combat, is putting skin in the game, right? It is their children do go to the war, because if you don't, they lose touch with the people that they're ruling. And I think that increasingly, especially what we see in Vietnam, is that college education becomes a reason to avoid military service. And so what we see is a bifurcation of society, the professional managerial class that's being created through the promulgation of the college system, college education, is being exempt. And these are the people who are going to go on to run Fortune 500 companies and run for office and get law degrees and be in high places of power. And the only ones experiencing combat are ones that come from military families or didn't have a way to avoid it. And so we see not only the removal of the ruling class from military obligation, but they become increasingly out of touch. And these people who already kind of think of themselves as a better than ruling class because they've acquired college educations and are now going to be, the masters of the universe. The elites have been produced, and they can now go, to take their place in the hierarchy. They're also completely out of touch with military reality, which they love to wield, right? And so I think that the isolation of the military class, the warrior class, is not only dangerous because of what it does to the warriors who are coming home, but also what it allows the elites to do and how it allows them to use and treat the military, who they no longer feel a part of.
Yeah, they don't have much of the people in charge, for the most part, don't have too much of a connection with the military. And then we talked about this somewhat in our last talk, how by creating a military caste in the United States that is separated from the general population, it allows people in positions of authority to use that military without much say from the people, which is very concerning in a republic. The people, military bases, facilities, for the most part, are out of sight, out of mind, and out of the view of the general population. And so this makes it much easier to send people away to conflict without much of an opinion from society, which is, again, why this separation of the military from the people is inherently bad for our republic and inherently dangerous, because you don't have much public opinion other than thank you for your service on how the military is supposed to be used. And then not only that, because it's violent and inherently dangerous, you have a leading caste or a elite caste who doesn't really want to participate in the military. And so now you've got people who were never in the military, in charge of the military, controlling a military that the general population feels no obligation to say how it should be used. That's not healthy. And then, to compound all of that, you've got a low trust society, which these people come back from war and combat, have a taste of a high trust society, come back home, and then attempt to reintegrate into a society that's very much fit in now and do your job, and I don't want to hear about any of your problems. And to a bunch of people who do have problems. And from my personal experience, trying to reintegrate, go back home and get my master's degree and take a basically a civil service type position back home. And I was very much they didn't fire me, but I was very much unwanted where I was working, and not only just one place, but several positions, to the point where I'm like, well, this is not a society I can participate in anymore, at least in this way. And that's why I went back into military contracting, because that's where I felt comfortable. I mean, that, when you don't even feel comfortable, working in the society that you're supposed to protect, yeah, that's a huge warning sign.
Yeah, I know that you just speaking a few basic truths in social situations at work ended up putting you into situations where, like you said, you were feeling unwanted. And I think that's, of course, something everyone
has those feelings, right? Like, it's not that this isn't unique to the military. The issue you're running into is you have a group of people who've seen how high trust society can function, and then goes back to ours, and they're like, well, this is no place I want to live anymore. And they handle it in different ways. They either go back, and you find the people who stay in the military have much lower rates of PTSD and reintegration issues, right? They're usually okay. It's the ones who get out that have the biggest issues, and to the point where they suffer from depression or kill themselves. Because, I mean, this is an inherently inhuman, our society, to the point where people are would rather die than live in this type of society.
Well, and I think, one of our viewers commented about how, equal opportunity, sexual harassment, all these different forces inside the military can even erode the trust in that, which I know is something that we talked about.
We did talk about
in our last talk. But obviously, we know that that the military is kind of the last stop for this stuff. That stuff is filtering into the military now. But it is everywhere in our current society, and I think that's one of the many things that makes it so low trust, is in the name of civility, in the name of smoothing out every rough edge and trying to make every interaction as unoffensive as possible. We've basically created these large Orwellian institutions that hunt down thought crime. And everyone is aware that this pressure is constantly there. We make jokes about North Korea and what it's like to live there. But in many ways, don't get me wrong, I'd still prefer to live here. But in many ways, we have very similar controls, or maybe China's the better example at this point, where, you have this constant social pressure. Everyone is aware of, everybody knows that they should be avoiding these certain things. But at least in China, the pressure is at least to be somewhat pro-social. In ours, it's almost entirely to be antisocial and create distrust. And that obviously is probably a big shock to someone coming back from a higher trust situation.
I mean, most definitely. It's a shock a lot of people can't handle. And those who can, some, obviously it's not everyone who has an issue reintegrating, but a lot of people just completely reject it to the point where, you can't go home again. And it's, and we being away for a long time. And I listened to this when you had your roundtable discussion. I've been away for a few years, and then to come back and to see the changes even over the last 2 years. I mean, we've got bitter division. Both sides on the political spectrum are claiming the other sides are enemies of the state. They're accusing them of treason. They're accusing them of being, either fascists or communists. Race relations are terrible in our country. The wealth gap is increasing significantly. And to see all of this is, a lot of people who are in the military are probably thinking, there's no way I could take a group of people that I see on the street into combat. They wouldn't survive. And dear God, why would I ever trust these people? So to say that it's a failure of reintegration on behalf of people coming back from combat is a bit of a misnomer. It's if our society can be resurrected or saved, the rest, the military is going to be fine. But that's the key issue here, right? Is our society is not doing so well. And it's getting worse. And the problem is you've got this minority of people, these military personnel, see this and are in their gut are one, disgusted, but then just terrified of what we've become, I think, in a lot of ways. And they express it in different ways, right? It's not necessarily a fear that's in the front of the head, but it's a feeling in our lizard brains that we just know this isn't right.
Absolutely. And I think, one of the things that I want to do is, now that we've kind of got that established, I probably want to talk to you about some of the developments we have seen in the last few days that are revealed kind of the way in which the military is being treated and being used, especially in what could possibly be an upcoming Biden administration. And guys, I want to remind you, if you have any questions and you want to put a little something in the tip jar, you can always use the super chat. We'll make sure to get to any of those by the end. We'll take others, but if you want to help out the channel, we always appreciate it. But to get back to that, what I've seen recently, of course, is Trump is not perfect on foreign policy by any stretch, but what we saw was a dedication to drawing down interventions, trying to bring troops back home, de-escalations in many ways. And as we have seen with the post-election and, at least the press's assumption that Joe Biden will be the new president, sorry, they have been making a lot of assertions as to how they're going to use the military. We're seeing a lot more discussion on how the United States needs to be involved in Syria. We're seeing a lot more discussion on, how it need to be kind of a forward footing when it comes to military again. And many people who thought that this was maybe the end of American expansion in these are pretty disheartened. A lot of people on the left originally went there because they said that they were anti-war, and they were anti-foreign intervention, and were against, George Bush and all these different things. But now we're seeing that actually there might be some of a realignment as the neocon foreign policy shifts back towards more the Democratic Party and the way that they're going to approach the, possible military intervention going forward.
I mean, like I said before, America's not at war. America's at the mall. Well, not at the mall anymore, but America is very much focused. The people of America are very much focused on internal struggles at the moment. And I don't think they really, other than maybe philosophically or just high-minded idealism, they don't really care what the military does or what countries we have an intervention in, as long as it doesn't affect them at home. I mean, this year people have spent more time at home than ever, right? If it's not on Netflix, if it's not on YouTube, if it doesn't affect their daily life, if it's not going to affect their Amazon packages getting to them, I really don't think most people really care where the military gets sent to or what missions that they have to do. And, the people in the military, really, a lot of them don't do it for the American people. They do it because there are Americans of which they trust and care about that are going to be going into dangerous situations. And these are their friends and family and brothers, and they're going to be there to support them. You get case studies of people being injured, and the first thing that they're concerned about is they're not going to be there for their unit, not how bad their injury is. It's they do it for each other. But the problem is the U.S. military and the U.S. people are not one and the same as they were in the past, which is very unfortunate.
Yeah, and I think that's why you can see, the left basically shift directly to a war footing when it suits them, because I don't think at the end of the day they were particularly attached to that position. I know.
No, they're not.
No, I mean, I remember, I it's funny because I tweeted out something a couple days ago that, all my left-wing friends are now, they're pro-military intervention, pro-CIA, and pro, corporate oligarchy. And it went crazy. Like it got like 500 retweets or something. And it went over to like normie left-wing Twitter, and they're all getting really angry. They're like, well, you don't know any left-wingers. You don't know what you're talking about. And I'm just thinking, look, I'm not talking about some random New York liberal. Like, I'm talking about my hardcore left-wing Marxist friends who, were, and like my hippie dope smoking friends who were peaceniks their entire life. All of a sudden, they found justification for these things. And so I think you're right. I think at the end of the day, those were.
I mean, what do they care? Like, they're not going.
Right, and they were just status markers, and shifting them isn't a problem if that's where their friends are now.
Right.
If that's where the popular support is now, they'll follow that wherever it's taken. They think of themselves as resisting. They think of themselves as counterculture, but of course they're the most conformist people that exist in society. They have all of the culturally normative progressive values. They push all of these things. They are at home at any college function. And so their opinions line up right with that. Now, one thing I thought, sorry, did you have something to say on that?
I do. And it kind of goes back just a little bit of what we talked about before with, there's been a transition in the United States where after Vietnam, the population was, let's say, blamed the military, the individuals in the military, for crimes committed in Vietnam, right? Like calling people baby killers or things of this nature. And what you found is because there was such a spike in PTSD rates and it was basically bad optics for the left, they disassociated the war from the military, right? Well, it's not your fault. It was what you were sent to do, which is insulting in a way because it claims that we don't have agency on our decisions, and that we have not chosen to join the military, but due to economic and social reasons, we were forced to join the military. And that's not the case. This is an all volunteer service, and I knew what I was doing when I joined, and I knew the risks that I could have to take if I joined, and the things that I may have to do if I joined. And so to remove agency from us is one, insulting, and it's just a more veiled way for them to attack us in a way. And I mean, I guess it happens on both sides, right? It was a pretty good PR campaign. Thank you for your service in general. Everyone says it, but it doesn't dig very deep. And I don't think I think it's a bit of a disservice to the American military in a lot of ways. But what you found is, so now it's not you, it's the conflict. But at the end of the day, like when behind closed doors, it's like, it's still us, right? That's still the thing to be looked down upon.
Well, it's what so much of our culture has become. It's the polite front while they spit on you as soon as anyone's not looking, right? Like they've manufactured,
or hit you in the back of the head.
Yeah, exactly. They manufactured the optic they need, but at the end of the day, the motivations are still the same. The attitude is still the same. The disdain is still the same. And that's again, that's something that I found interesting.
I would prefer they just be honest about it.
Well, I think we all would, but that's the low trust society you're talking about, right? Is no one can be honest. Right. No one, everybody has to put forward this best face. We've hyper rationalized communication to the point where no one can just be honest with each other anymore.
It's exhausting.
To be honest, to be forthright, to be direct with someone is to be stupid and lowbrow, right? And this is why Trump was so successful, is whatever you say about the man, he is direct, right? And he discarded many of these niceties, and that was just so refreshing for so many people who are looking to hear that kind of communication. But one thing I wanted to ask you about as well was that we learned after the election that the general staff and other parts of the defense architecture had been lying to Trump about how many troops had been placed in Syria to make it seem like the numbers were lower and forces were being drawn down when they weren't. It was actually a much larger number. And they actually openly admitted to lying to the person who is, in theory, the commander-in-chief in order to keep him involved in a situation where he thought he had a much smaller force than he did.
I mean, yeah, when you have top military officials fudging the numbers to the commander-in-chief, I think that's a pretty good indication of where their loyalties actually are. And it's obviously not with that particular president. And if they can, it sets a pretty dangerous precedent where if they're willing to do it with him, who's to say they're not willing to do it with anybody?
Yeah, well, and I think in general, it kind of shows you, this is something I've talked a lot about on the channel. Many people on the right, they want to say, well, if we fight back and we take over the Republican Party and we push good people forward and we change these laws, then we'll be able to kind of right this ship. We'll be able to turn it around. And what I think situations like that show is that even when you have a Republican in the presidency, and even when you have someone who should be directly in charge of the military, of that executive agency, we still see the deep state make it impossible for him to actually make meaningful changes. And this is why I think something that the right needs to understand is that those electoral victories can be important in the short term for kind of staging purposes and visual purposes. But when it comes to actually affecting power, we can see that kind of the fix is in. And even if you do keep someone in theoretically the in front of, in charge, that will not maybe actually change the long-term outcome until the whole system is fixed.
I mean, in certain less civilized societies, if a general did that to their commander, it would be interesting. And there wouldn't be no reaction.
The solution would be rather public and gruesome, right?
It would be
in most of those other situations, and the fact that it's basically just shrugged off. And not only were they happy to announce it, but the media cheered it. Oh, look at the military ignoring the president, doing whatever they want. That's quite eye-opening.
Low trust society. I know we keep talking about it this particular talk, but I mean, it's everything. That it makes so much more sense to me after hearing those talks and having our discussions, how the way I feel makes a lot more sense now than it did even a year ago. And I don't feel, for lack of a better term, I don't feel crazy for feeling the way I do.
Well, absolutely. Well, I think this is a good time probably then to go to a super chat we have here. It's from Not Omegon. Sorry if I pronounced that incorrectly. But he asks, what's your advice? What advice would you give to a new officer? You're somebody obviously who was in the officer corps and was somebody with combat experience. Obviously, you're talking about some of the problems now, but what would be your advice to someone who still wants to serve, still is going in? What would you say to them?
Sure. You, as a lieutenant or as an ensign, fortunately, you're just going to be drinking from the fire hose when it comes to training. My advice for a new officer would be to, obviously spend as much time as you can learning your tactical skills and your operational skills, whatever your job is. And also try to hop onto as many secondary schools as you can hop onto. You're really not going to start to get into the politics of the military till you're at the very least a captain and more likely a major or lieutenant colonel, when you're really going to start to get into the more of the politics. You're in a fun place as a new officer. You get to spend the most time with your soldiers or your airmen or your sailors. I come from an Army background, so I'm not trying to not include anyone, your Marines, but I tend to look at it through Army optics. You're going to set yourself up for your career if you choose to to have a career in the military, that's the time you're going to be doing all your important training. Or if you want to spend a few years, you're 8 years in if you're an officer, I'm assuming. It's going to set you up to be successful in whatever your career post-military is. So don't try to focus too much on the big issues here. Focus on your training, and get as many qualifiers as you can, and get as much experience, I would say logistically, as you can, because that's probably going to serve you best outside the military as far as jobs or whatnot are concerned. So focus on you. Don't worry too much about the big picture, because you're not quite there yet as a new officer. But keep your ear to the ground. And I would always say you learn more from bad leaders than you do from good ones. So, obviously listen to good advice, but watch what bad leaders are doing, because you're going to learn a whole lot more from them as far as what not to do and what not to be as a leader.
Yeah, and that's great advice. And I think you're right, especially when it comes to that transition from captain to major. My dad was in the military growing up, and it was a long time ago, obviously, things are not where they are now. But he would always say it's when you really make that transition from captain to majors, when you start feeling the political aspect of the military get involved. So that early time, like you said, it is a fairly different experience.
That's a fun time. Yeah. Like if I could just stay a second lieutenant the entire time in the military, I would have, because it's the most fun I ever had.
So thanks. Yeah, we appreciate that question, man. That was a really great question. And obviously, like Ostrakon just said, not to be trite, but really we thank you for your service. I know in times like this, it can be conflicting to go into something like that, but I have the highest respect. Like, I grew up in a military family, large parts of my family military, obviously good friends military. I have the highest respect for people who, no matter what, are willing to put themselves in that situation. So
it's still the best adventure you're going to have, but yep, it's being a young officer is a really fun time.
Absolutely. Well, man, we went through a lot here. We covered a lot of ground, but was there any part of that you wanted to go back to that we didn't get to address? I know you had a lot to say about kind of that low trust society transition. I wanted to make sure that we hit everything you wanted to talk about.
No, we pretty much covered everything that I wanted to go over. I think it wasn't just about the reintegration, but it is also our society as well, and how really the failure of integration is almost the canary in the coal mine as far as the health of our society, right? So it's try not to look at it so much as the failure of people in the military coming back to the United States, but the failure of the United States in keeping up its promise to the American people, and that it's it's a society that we intrinsically know is not healthy, and we may not be able to necessarily express that rationally sometimes, but like I said, in our lizard brain, we know. And coming from that type of situation in the military, being in a close-knit society, I think that's the big reason why so many people have a hard time coming back to the United States. You can never come home again, but home is definitely not what it used to be.
Yeah, and that is something that increasingly I think about, because you're right. I think the military highlights it because of the rapidity of that transition, and because they're some of the few people have truly tasted kind of maybe the older ways or the more normal ways, the more natural ways. But the fact that everybody, like you said, can just feel in their lizard brain that the way we are interacting socially is incredibly unhealthy. And I think it does us all good to remember that everybody is trying to process this, whether they're coming back from military or they're just trying to go to church and get married and raise a family. So many, I see it so many times on Twitter, people I follow or follow me, and they'll talk about the difficulty of finding someone that they can settle down with and just start a normal family. And so even if it's not the military, just the basic aspects of society have been made difficult by the way we've structured it, and I think intentionally so. And I think we're all feeling those effects, whether we're coming back from a deployment or just trying to get a job and a family in the current society. I think we all feel that the way this has been structured is working against us just living a normal, healthy human life.
I 100% agree with that. It's it may be felt more strongly by people coming back from combat, but we're all feeling it. We just we just know it's not supposed to be that way, maybe a little more acutely than some other people, but everyone feels it, and humans are not meant to function this way. And the numbers don't lie.
Absolutely. And in order to not leave on a dour note, guys, because I don't want it to feel like, obviously we've talked a lot about problems here, but I want you to remember that you can make positive changes. You can make the decision. You can worship God. You can head to church. You can build that community. You can reach out to people. I know we've got great Discord communities, great Twitter communities. Twitter's not always a great place when it comes to emotional health. Make sure you're talking to good people, but reach out to people, guys. Make those connections. You need people who you can talk to. I know so many people who have joined YouTube, and gotten to the sphere that we're in right now, and said, "Look, I just did it because I just needed another person who was in touch with reality to talk to. I just needed to talk to somebody else who realized the world was crazy too. I just needed someone else who could say, this is not what's supposed to happen, and I'm not crazy for thinking that, and we can, in finding someone to talk about that." So make sure, you don't get down, guys. Read important books, do things that are going to make you a better person. Go work out, go exercise,
It'll make you feel better.
Yeah, exactly. It's going to make you feel better. Make social connections. Put yourself on a positive track. Don't let this discussion make you feel like there aren't good options, because there absolutely are. There are other people out there like you. They're listening to this. They're talking about this kind of stuff, and the only way out is through. At the end of the day, and so you've got to work towards those goals.
If you're walking through hell, keep walking.
Keep moving. Yep, absolutely.
And don't worry, guys. You're not crazy for feeling that the world is crazy, because it is. It does, but what Auron said, worry about the little things, and that goes back to the comment before, where focus on the little things to improve your daily life and have some control over the things that you can have control over: your physical body, eating well, socializing when you can. It's so important to socialize, and the rest will have to work itself out. But worry about the little things.
Yeah, I mean, you and I have had different ends of that experience. You with the military, and kind of me with the loss of my wife. But we both know that at the end of the day, you have to get out there and you have to make those decisions to have kind of a better tomorrow. And a lot of people will rag on Jordan Peterson and his clean up your room thing. But at the end of the day, he's right. Like
he's absolutely right.
It's the small changes, taking charge of your life, showing yourself that you have agency, getting in touch with something that's more important and the people around you. That's what's going to keep you sane in an insane world. And
the little things that keep the darkness at bay.
Absolutely. All right, guys. Well, thanks for coming by. I want to thank Ostrakon, obviously, for joining me. He doesn't have a Twitter or anything, because he's probably making the smart decisions. So I can't shout out any of his stuff. But it's always a great talk. Yeah, absolutely.
I'm a little more set up now, and hopefully my voice came through a lot more smoothly this time with my new microphone. So I definitely want to participate more in some future discussions.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much for coming by, guys. We had a lot of people. We had a lot of great conversations in chat. Really appreciate you watching. If you want to follow me on Twitter, the links to do so are below in the description. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, you can do that. And if you do want to throw something in the tip jar, I do have my Subscribestar link down there if you want to make any donation. Again, we really appreciate you guys watching. And as always, we'll talk to you next time.